Good. Good evening, everyone. I think most people have come in and are seated, and at NLC, we're nothing if not prompt. It's 7:30. So welcome and thank you for coming out tonight for our first in-person event in our series, The Power of Trees. We are located in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Beausoleil, and Georgina Island First Nations. The Williams Treaty First Nations have been stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters, and today remain vigilant over their health and integrity for generations to come. We are all treaty people. Barbara Mokchuinkwe Hall is a Bodowe-Wadami Anishinaabe of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and a traditional knowledge holder. I'm asking her how I did. Whew. Barbara is a storyteller, an educator, a professional engineer, a writer, and dreamer. She lives near Peterborough and is an assistant professor of Indigenous Environmental Studies and Sciences in Trent University's Shawnee Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies. She is also Director of Studies for the Indigenous Studies PhD program. Barbara is frequently requested as a guest speaker. In fact, you may have heard her on CBC this morning, where she was kind enough to get up very early to highlight tonight's talk and help promote NLC. Thank you, Barbara. Barbara is a mother, an auntie, a daughter, and a grandmother with a capital G, which she will explain. Her interests include reclaiming, remembering, and revitalizing women's knowledges and practices, and decolonizing education using Indigenous pedagogies. Barbara spends time on the beautiful waters of the Great Lakes Basin, nurtures traditional Anishinaabe foods, and works with the trees to turn sweet water into maple sugar. So without further ado, may I present Barbara.
It always feels weird listening to those introductions, like, who are you talking about? Anin, Bojo, Mokchuinkwe, Indejnakas, Uwawashkesh, Ndodem, Bodwe Wadmi Anishinaabe Kwe, Minwa Wim Tagoji Kwe Ndao, Shishi Baniak Deben Dagwis, Shawnee, Oklahoma, and Donjaba, Mississauga, Anishinaabe Ake, Indida. So I like to introduce myself in what the wee tiny bit of my ancestral language that I'm working on reclaiming and learning and pronouncing. And this way of introducing ourselves really is representative, I think, of, or acknowledges, uh-oh, I'm losing my mic. Glasses and mic together. Okay, I think we're okay. Really is an acknowledgement of the relationality and the relationships and demonstrates the worldview of the Anishinaabe. So what I told you, the last thing that I told you, similar to a land acknowledgement, I told you that I live here now in Mississauga, Anishinaabe territory. Before that, I mentioned Shawnee, Oklahoma, and that's the community of my grandfather. He was the last of my family to live in our community in Oklahoma. He is a survivor of 2 Indian boarding schools in the United States, so similar to residential schools here in Canada. And going from Carlisle Industrial Indian School in Pennsylvania, he never really went back to Oklahoma. So he is part of the inspiration for the work that I do, for the reclaiming and the remembering, because with his entire childhood into young adulthood being spent in residential school, our disconnection with the culture occurred. It was an extreme disruption. So acknowledging the land that I live on, acknowledging the land that my grandfather comes from, I also acknowledged that I am Potawatomi, Anishinaabe, and French. So Potawatomi have mixed ancestry. I shared with you Wawashkesh Ndodem, which means that my clan is the Deer Clan. I come from the Hoof Clan. And I shared with you my Anishinaabe name of Mokchuwinkwe. Normally, we don't translate our names because that would be like translating what Robert means. But it is an inspiration for a lot of the work that I do. So Mokchuwin Chewin refers to water as it's flowing. Mok refers to the earth, so this is water as it's flowing from within the earth, so a spring, so an artesian spring. And Kwe refers to that feminine energy and sometimes being used to identify women. So that's who I am from an Anishinaabe perspective, and introducing myself that way holds me accountable to all of those relationships, holds me accountable to the land here, to my community, and my aunties and uncles that still live in Shawnee, makes me very conscious of the words that I use, because the words have power, right? And I need to use them in a good way and be accountable to all of my relations, including my clan and my family and the spirits where my name came from. So I also want to tell you that I am not a dendrologist. I am not a tree scientist. As Elizabeth introduced me, I'm an engineer and a social scientist, but I love trees. I identify with trees. They heal me, they lift me up, and I find the relationship that we have with them utterly fascinating. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, but I also wanted to share a little bit about this worldview that I introduced in my traditional introduction. And this is, David will recognize this, this is the biocultural framework that we use in our Indigenous Environmental Studies and Sciences courses, but what it really represents is the Anishinaabe worldview, or the Indigenous worldview. And starting with the concept or the premise that all Indigenous cultures, whether they be here in Ontario or they're in Brazil or they're in Indonesia, have a very strong, intimate relationship with the land, the water, and the cosmos. And what you see when you're outside of the culture is our practices, right? Maybe our food ways, maybe the way our traditional dress appears, maybe our dances and our songs. You see those, but underneath this are our beliefs that come from our traditional stories, our sacred stories, our creation stories, our recreation stories. And these help guide our worldview, the way that we see the world, just like your own Genesis stories and creation stories help you in the way that you practice and walk in this world. And our values coming from our foundational teachings, such as the 7 grandfather or grandmother teachings of love, respect, bravery, truth, honesty, wisdom, and humility. These values guide us in the way that we walk. And the attitudes. So attitudes, I think that I want to include the attitudes of responsibility, of relationality, of relationship, and of reciprocity, all coming from our teachings, our stories, and all really emphasizing that responsibility to all of our relations that include the land, the water, and the cosmos, and those more than human beings that we live with, so those other beings of creation. And holding up, honoring those relationships, nurturing those relationships, and upholding the attitude of reciprocity, so including gratitude and giving back in that relationship with all of those beings of creation. So this all leads to what we call Manobamadzuin, which is good way of living, or that good life. So living in a good way allows you to live a good life. Thinking about, sorry, my mouth has gone dry, I'm so nervous in front of all of you. Usually I talk to 20-somethings, right? And they're all on their phones while we're during lecture. So it's kind of like, okay, there's faces looking at me. It's like, whoa, this is a new experience. But thinking about the place-based nature of Anishinaabe culture and Manobamadzuin, this is the place, the Mitig, Waking, Getchizagananak. So the place of the trees, or the place where the trees grow, and the Great Lakes. So the Great Lakes Basin is Anishinaabe territory and has been Anishinaabe territory for millennia. And it is this place that, or where our ancestors paddled their Wigwasi Jiman, their birch bark canoes, and where we continue to paddle and we continue to thrive. The Anishinaabe have always been a canoe people, a water-based culture and a water-based people. And if you look closely on this map, what I've included is place names in Anishinaabemowin or in Bodwe-Wadmin, which is the Potawatomi language. And the place names are so different from the way mainstream society or colonized society names things. Within each one of these place names is a story, is a teaching, is a being or an event that has happened, rather than being named after a settler colonist. So Chicago is down here, and Chicagon is the Anishinaabe word for Chicago, so you can see how it's been anglicized, and it really refers to the place where the skunk cabbage grows. So our place names are knowledge holders, right? So if you want skunk cabbage, go to the southern tip of Lake Michigan, and you will find skunk cabbages there. Giwani, up here on Door County, the Door Peninsula, that is near Green Bay, Wisconsin. Go Packers, refers to the prairie chicken. And then there's other names that talk about the history of the area. So again, I'm really trying to emphasize that relationship, that embedded relationship with place. And now I want to kind of expand from there to talk about my understanding of the Bodwe-Wadmi Anishinaabe cosmos. And I'm only talking about the really a couple layers that exist above the surface of the earth. There's another 4 layers that go into the earth, but we're not going to go there. We only have 45, 50 minutes to talk tonight. So Shkakmi-kwe is my understanding of the word that we use for our original mother, the earth. Shkakmi-kwe. You see that kwe, and similar to the ending of my Anishinaabe name, referring to that feminine energy of creation of the earth. And this first layer, mitig waning. So mitig is tree. Waning is locative suffix that talks about the place of the trees. And this is where we are, right? This is where we live. This is where we walk. This is where our children grow. This is inhabited by our more than human relatives. Because in our cosmology, in our creation stories, we're the last to be lowered down to the earth. So all of those other beings, the rocks, our grandfathers and grandmothers, our eldest brothers and sisters, the plants and the trees and the medicine, thinking about the crawlers, so the insects, the salamanders, the fish, the flyers, the birds, and the four-leggeds were all here before us. They have a much longer lived experience of how to live that good life, how to live in a sustainable way. They can teach us. As the last ones here, we rely on those other beings for everything, right? For our food, for our shelter, for everything that we need. And Mitigwanning is the only place where we experience time. Those other layers of the cosmos, time is undefined. But in Mitigwanning, time is evidenced by day and night. That's put into motion by our grandfather, the sun, Mishomis Gisis, our grandmother, the nighttime sun, Nokmis Debek Gisis. So day and night as evidence of time. And that seasonal cycle of the journey of Mishomis Gisis around of the earth around Mishomis Gisis. And then the 13 moons, the 13 full moons that occur in that annual journey of Shkakmikwe around our grandfather's sun, the seasonal cycle is evidence of time. And it's important to note that these celestial bodies, we consider them our relatives, right? Using those grandmother and grandfather terms. And Nungos Kwanning is where they reside. So Nungos meaning star, Kwanning meaning the place of the star. And really kind of a spoon, an upside down spoon-shaped place. So think about when you go out and you look at the sky and you can see the stars and you can see that arch. It's kind of like the underside of a spoon. And this is also where our ancestors live. And the constellations are formed by our ancestors, and the constellations also guide us on Earth. So our knowledge is all these relationships with the star world, with all the beings of creation that exist in Mitigwanning. Our knowledges emanate from these relationships, from our observation of these beings. And we work to maintain respectful, reciprocal relationships. And we learn from those, so considering all of our relatives as teachers, and an example of this ability to learn from more than human beings is our relationship with the Mikwug, so the beavers. The beavers sitting over here. And their image, of course, appears here on a birch bark makuk, a basket or a container. So our stories, think back to the biocultural framework, right, where beliefs come from and attitudes and values. Our stories and our elders share how much we have learned from a mikwug, from the beavers. We've learned how to live well in community, to live as a family and as a clan, how to build lodges, how to store food for winter, how to take care of our relations, and the environment, how to protect nebe, how to protect water, and how to live in reciprocal relationship with mitigog, with the trees. So with this in mind, with kind of setting the stage of knowledge is coming from relationship, I want to talk about the power of trees. That's what this is about, right? That's what this series is about. And I ask you to consider the trees. Consider not only what these elder relatives generously provide for us, so shelter, food, beauty, shade, music, inspiration, and oxygen that we and many of our relatives breathe. I ask you to consider what I shared about Anishinaabe people living in the Great Lakes, living within this place of the trees for millennial, living in a long-term, continuing place-based relationship with the trees, and begin to consider trees as teachers. So what can we learn from trees? We can learn by watching the way that they grow, and we can model that, being deeply rooted in land and water, being connected to our mother, the earth, while reaching towards the sky world. So reaching towards those ancestors, connecting to them while having our roots firmly planted in the ground. And that, I think, demonstrates a way of life, a way of being, a way of connection to the present and to the past and to the future, because that's where our new life comes from the sky world. They teach us to be flexible, yet strong, and to continually adapt to the environment around us. They teach us about communicating, right? All that new Eurocentric science that has identified that trees communicate with each other, that trees nurture and nourish each other through communication. And they also teach us, if we watch them through that seasonal cycle, they teach us when to store our energy and sustenance when the days grow shorter, right? What the trees are doing right now. And to rest when that healing blanket of white covers the earth. To actually rest rather than gear up for that hecticness of the holiday season that we all do, right? And then they teach us, they show us the time to reawaken when the sun comes out stronger and the days get longer and the melting snow and ice cleanse the earth as our mother, the earth, is preparing for new life. And when that sweet sap comes from the maple trees, that's when we get active again, right? That's when the Anishinaabe New Year starts, when that sap runs. So what I want to do tonight is share with you my lived experience with wigwasatig, with the white or the paper birch tree. And I want to express gratitude to this relative for all that they give. We're canoe people, as I've said before. So Jiman, or our canoes, have been our mode of transportation here in Mitigwaning forever. They're also, from a metaphysical sense, our mode of transportation between worlds, between levels of the cosmos. Really important relatives are canoes. And the experience that I want to share with you is centered on the building of a Wigwasi Jiman, or a birch bark canoe, at Trent. And we did this as part of the PhD program in Indigenous Studies. Did this in 2016, so it was kind of a while ago, but it's it's still so fresh in my memory. It was such a profound experience for me. And what was really cool is we built it in the atrium of Battle Library. So we were always kind of going like, oh, you know, this is the colonial storage facility of knowledge. There's books, and here we're bringing indigenous knowledge into the library, and we are changing it up. So we did this in February, right before Reading Week, when there were tons of students in the library, and we promised the librarians that we would be quiet and that it wouldn't be a smelly procedure. We kind of broke that promise when an electric chainsaw came out the first couple days, and then I'll show you later on what we did with spruce gum. But we were led by a duo of canoe builders and birch bark artists from southern Michigan. And what's so amazing about this project is nearly 150 pairs of hands helped build this canoe. So these hands were the hands of student, faculty, and staff at Trent, folks from Hiawatha First Nation, from Alderville, from Curve Lake, Peterborough community members, which really interestingly included some retired canoe builders, cedar strip canoe builders. Unfortunately, I didn't participate in the harvesting of the trees for the canoe. The harvesting takes place through the seasonal cycle and relies on those respectful, reciprocal relationships and a diversity of trees and ecosystems and deep knowledge not only of the trees, but what is required in the canoe building process. And I'll share a bit of the harvesting process with you as we walk through this journey of jimanake, or making a birch bark canoe. First, a little refresher about trees, and birch trees, as you know, from just being around them and seeing them, have some very unique properties that have to do with their skin, right, with their bark. So the outer bark and the inner bark of the birch tree. And I just wanted to remind you of the structure of the trunk of a tree. Because this unique bark growth, so cherry trees and birch trees are the only trees that have these, what's called lenticels, growing in the horizontal direction. And my understanding from Elder Google is that these lenticels allow for the exchange of gases between the tissue of the tree and in the environment. So there's a relationship right there between the tree and the environment. So the exchange of oxygen, of carbon dioxide, and of water vapor. And this horizontal nature of these lenticels reflects really the direction of the structural properties of the bark. This is where my engineering background comes in. I won't get too detailed. But the circular compression strength of the bark, or the behavior of the bark. And there's different bark on the birch tree depending on the season. So in winter, or winter bark, as the tree is probably happening about right now, as the trees are beginning to prepare for that long dormancy, the outer bark and the inner bark fuse together very tightly. In the springtime, before the sap starts to run in the birch trees, they separate. So we have winter bark and summer bark. Canoe hulls are made out of winter bark. And that's what you see here. And canoe makers will tell you that that bark needs to be at least a nickel thick. So there's a nickel, it's at least a nickel thick, maybe even 2 nickels thick. Very good bark. And what you see here is the part of the inner bark, but there's also inner bark fused together with the outer bark. I told David that I needed to keep my speaking notes in front of me because I don't want to launch into a IESS 1001H Section A lecture. So I'm trying to check where I am. One of the things about canoe bark is that you want it as thick and as clear as possible. So clear meaning as straight. The tree as straight as possible, not with any twists in it, and as few knots as possible, right? Because knots make holes, and holes in the bottom of a canoe, I think we know where we go with that. But this slide shows that circular or compression strength of the bark. And so this is deadfall, and you can see here where the wood has rotted away and the bark maintains that circular compression, right? It maintains that form in a circle. And if you were to cut this perpendicular to those lenticels, the bark tends to open up and curl with the inside of the bark on the outside of the curl. And if you leave it long enough, or if it coils very tightly, it becomes very, very strong. I'll show you in a little bit later. There's some curled birch bark as a handle for that macaque over there. So you can start to see that if the bark is turning inside out and starting to curl, you can imagine the shape. It's taking the shape of the hull of a canoe. So here is the harvest of some winter bark. And you can see that this is on a very clear, straight tree of a good height, right? Because there's a ladder hanging over here. And it's demonstrating really the respectful harvest of the bark and understanding that birch bark can split along those lenticels. So using clamps and a piece of wood along the edge to maintain the quality of the edge and not have it split. Because when you're removing this winter bark, in many cases, it's girdling the tree, so the tree will not live after this process, and you want to make sure that you use all of the material from the tree in a good way. My understanding of this tree is that it was, well, let me back up a little bit. Canoe trees are really, as I already said, they are very unique in that you're looking for that clear, long reach of bark for your hull. And in a area where there's a lot of birch trees, which there's not a lot of areas anymore where there healthy birch trees of big diameter, old growth birch trees, 1 in 1,000 or 2,000 trees is a good canoe tree. So that lets you know about the length of time that it takes to harvest and the knowledge of the harvesting area that it takes to be able to find a good canoe tree. So harvesting with care, with consent, and with respect. So now we're going to fast forward to day 3 of the GMON, or the canoe build in the library. I don't have any pictures of days 1 and 2 because they were spent installing the platform for building, cleaning the bark, piecing and stitching pieces of bark together because we were unable to secure a singular piece of birch bark large enough for a hull. And you can also see in here that there's a frame here made out of cedar to kind of guide the shape of the canoe. There's a very similar frame in the bottom on the floor of what will become the hull. And then there are grandmothers and grandfathers, our eldest relatives. There's rocks holding down the bark of the canoe, holding the canoe in place as it's being built. So the tree and the way the bark grows dictates the construction of the internal frame of the canoe. So if you're building, my understanding, I've never witnessed the building of a cedar strip canoe, but you build the frame and then you tack on the hull, right? The cedar strips. It's opposite in the building of a birch bark canoe. You create the hull first and then you insert the frame, the ribs and the thwarts into the canoe. And here in this picture, so there's the birch, there's maple saplings that are kind of pinning the bark into place. There's the cedar frame, and then all of the stitching is made out of spruce root, and we'll talk about that. So this tree community coming together to build this canoe. No unnatural materials used in this canoe, no nails, no metal, no plastic, all wood materials. So here's a picture of the inner whale, the outer whale. Here's the hull, the birch bark. Again, it turned inside out, right? So if you see paintings in antique stores that show the birch bark canoes and they're all white, that's not right. The white is on the inside, but when we think of birch, we think of white bark, right? So here's a running stitch made out of spruce root, and you can see that there's cuts in the bark. There's vertical cuts here that we call gores to help pull the bark in and get that nice shape of the outside of the canoe. So let me introduce you to Gagawans, black spruce. Black spruce is preferred. We use the roots and the gum. And the root harvesting is challenging, time-consuming. There's so much physical effort to dig down into the soil and find those thin roots. And to make a canoe, all the stitching, all the lashing that you'll get to see through this process, it's estimated that you need 1 to 2 kilometers of spruce root. You treat it really respectfully and responsibly because you don't want to run out. We did run out in the middle of our canoe build and had to send out an emergency call for spruce root. But here it is. It's been debarked, so the bark of the roots have been taken off, and here it is soaking in water, held down by a grandfather, getting ready to be split. So you have to harvest it, you have to clean it, you have to soak it, and then you get to split the root. This is where we learn patience. And we learn to observe the grain of the root, and we let the root guide our hands. Because if you force it, if you just said, hey, I know what I'm doing, root, you're not going to tell me what to do, and you start to split it, it will break into small pieces. And remember, you want a kilometer of spruce root. So what happens is if you imagine spruce root being round, of course it's not this big, but you split it into 3 parts. So you end up with 2 half-round pieces, and then you end up with a flat piece from the middle. I should have a slide to illustrate that, but I think that you can imagine that. And we use the half rounds. Here we're using the half rounds 2 pieces. You see a piece sticking out here and a piece going in that direction to lash that inner whale made out of cedar to the outer whale made out of cedar to secure the birch bark hull. So here it is with all the lashing done. And you notice the spaces between the lashing. That's where the ribs go. You'll see that in a little bit. Here we have some temporary thwarts, so pushing against that circular compression behavior of the bark to open up the canoe, and to, there's quite a bit of pressure there that the thwarts, that are exerted on the thwarts. Here is a permanent thwart. You can see that it's lashed. You can also see the running stitch here that's made out of the flat piece of spruce bark, of spruce root. The lashing made out of the half rounds. And you can see that cedar frame in the bottom, and then again the grandfather's holding down the boat. We made these thwarts. Here's the center thwart out of maple, and the temporary thwarts were made out of cedar. Here again is another shot of the running stitch on the inside of the canoe, and here we're trimming off some of the bark, the excess bark. So let me introduce you to Gijagatig, or cedar, literal translation, sky tree, connects to stories, creation stories, stories of sky woman falling and the sky tree. Cedar is amazing, amazing wood, harvested out of cedar swamps in the cold months, right? It's much easier to walk on frozen ground than through the boggy stuff. And you can see how easily it splits here. And again, like I said, that you have to really know the tree and you have to find that perfect canoe tree. You also have to find that perfect cedar tree that is straight grained without knots. You want it very clear, because you want to be able to use a single piece of cedar for the gunnels and the inner whales and the outer whales. So harvesting it using an axe and a wedge and a mallet. Just driving that mallet, and that's how easy the tree splits. And you can see that this one in particular is beautiful because it's so straight. Remembering that relationship and that responsibility when you're taking the life of another being, to use the tree in a good way, to use all of the aspects of the tree, including the bark. So here, Jillian's taking off the outer bark and then coiling up the bark, and it's going to be used in weaving. So weaving of cedar bags. Out west, cedar is used for clothing, for hats, and also using it, dyeing it and making cedar mats. So mats to put on the ground, mats to use as lodge covers, and this particular mat used as a sail for a birch bark canoe. So if you look really closely, you've got the regular thwarts, and here's an additional one with a hole drilled through it for the mast, and there's where the other end of the mast goes, and there's the sail in the bottom. And this canoe was sailed this summer on Lake Superior, over in the Apostle Islands, the western part of Lake Superior. And then you can see this rope here. And this rope is made out of the next tree that I want to introduce you to. And that's American basswood, sometimes known as the linden tree, or wigwab natik. A tree that gives so many gifts. So there's medicinal values. Has anybody ever smelled the flowers of a linden tree? Oh my gosh, so sweet, right? So the flowers and the leaves are a good medicine when made into tea for treating anxiety. Something really important for us all to use in this time of world chaos and climate chaos. But the bark of the basswood tree, with its unique acoustical properties, being used in making guitars and being used in making water drums for Anishinaabe people and Haudenosaunee people. And then the bark. So again, that responsible harvest, that honorable harvest of using all of the tree. What's really cool, I think, I just love this. I'm such a geek about basswood. What I want to show you is when you take the inner bark and you roll it up into hanks and submerge it in like still water, like a pond or something, for 2 to 3 weeks until it starts to smell really rank. When the fibers start to break down, then you know it's done. And it starts to look like this. And this can be separated and finer and finer and finer into these fibers. So here's a whole mess of basswood fibers and made into cordage. Just rolled together into very, very strong cordage or rope. And then the cordage being woven into bags. So this is a bag that is being made to filter maple sap in the sugar bush. And the bag, actually, as it's been finished, is right here. And you can come up and look at these later. Whoops, they like to be touched. They like to interact with their human relatives, so feel free. They're not going to break. Another use, a similar use of a twined open weave bag is a corn washing bag. But where we used it in the canoe, we'll get to that. But we're going to go back to cedar. And here the canoe builder has a piece of cedar, straight grained cedar, that is about 1 inch by 2 inches, and he's delaminating it. So he's gotten it wet, he steamed it in boiling water, he's separating it along the growth rings. And the purpose of doing this, he was really having fun. He's like, I'm gonna see how many I can separate it into. And I think he got above about 38, right? So 2 inches divided into 38. And he said he could go further. It was like, Kevin, take it easy. It's okay. So the purpose of this is to be able to create that flexibility, extreme flexibility, because what's going on here is he is building the internal structure for the bow and the stern of the canoe. Almost bent 180 degrees, tied with basswood fiber. This is forming the outer edge, or the leading edge of the bow of the canoe. And it's connected to what is called a man board. This is not the internal structure of the canoe that we built. The canoe that we built is about 13 feet. This one's a 24-footer, I think. So this is much more elaborate and much bigger. But I like this picture. I didn't have any pictures of the ones that we built. So this is all the basswood wound up with, cedar, tied with basswood, and then usually maple piece that goes into the man board. If you're having a hard time imagining where this goes on the canoe, here is a man board, right? So this piece, this edge of this piece in the canoe that we are building. So now what's happening is using cedar again to create the sheathing that goes on the bottom of the hull of the inside of the hull on the bottom, made out of cedar that has been separated again to like thin cardboard, so like cardboard like a cereal box cardboard or less than that. And this sheathing will not only protect the canoe hull from the wear and tear of passengers and cargo, but is a really important engineering concept, because thinking about the bark and the strength of the bark going this way, then you put the sheathing and the strength is this way. So you have two layers of opposing strength that really makes the hull almost bomb-proof. These canoes, they look fragile, you think they're fragile, but they're very, very strong. This is where we made the library smell. So here, this is a shot. We are cooking bigu, or black spruce gum. So harvested off of black spruce where there's been a cut in the bark or a broken off branch, right? It kind of, the spruce tree exudes this gum that forms a Band-Aid and protects the tree. A good teacher, because you can use spruce gum as Band-Aids on our skin as well. But here what we're doing is we took that raw, hard, brittle spruce gum and we're cooking it over a hot plate to cook off the volatiles, to cook off the terpenes that make turpentine. So you can imagine what the library smelled like. Cooking spruce, it smelled like cold medicine. And with that harshness of turpentine smell. And students either really liked it because they said, oh, all of a sudden my sinuses are clear, this is wonderful. And then there was other students that said, I can't study in here any longer. We only did it for a couple, maybe a half a day, cooking down the bigu and driving off the volatiles. Because the volatiles, if they stay in there, they end up keeping the bark very brittle. And if you're going to be sealing up the hull of a canoe, you don't want it to be brittle, right? Because if you run into something, the sealant's going to break off and you're going to spring a leak. So taking that cooked and processed gum and filtering it through burlap to remove the pieces of bark, the pieces of lichen, little bugs and things like that. So you have really clear gum. But it has to be tempered, because if it was just to cool, again, it would be very brittle. So what happens with this is you need to add fat to the spruce gum. And some people use butter. I've heard people using chicken fat. We used bear grease, so rendered bear fat, and mixed a little bit at a time into the gum, and then spread the hot gum on a piece of birch bark, of course, because that's where it's going to go, and then dipped it in cold water, and then checked the pliability and the flexibility, and adjusted it until it was flexible in very cold water, because we knew that we were going to launch this canoe in February in the Otonabee River, and we were going to hope that it was a day where there wasn't a lot of ice. So the more my understanding, my recollection, the more bare fat, the more flexible it will remain in cold water. So now comes applying that bigu mixed with makwa made, or bear fat. And you can see that we have put it along the running stitch. And then these are patches of linen that cover some of the gore stitching. The gore stitching is usually done with the half-rounded pieces. And what you're trying to do is eliminate any stress points for when you put the sheathing and the ribs into the canoe. And it's really a wonderful thing to do. I don't know if you've ever played with warm spruce gum, but it feels so good on your hands. It's kind of like Play-Doh, but not really. It's much more viscous than Play-Doh. And to keep it from sticking on your hands, you dip your hands in soapy water, and that just keeps it from sticking onto your hands. Well, I think there was something I wanted to point out. No, maybe not. Okay, so sealing up the inside of the canoe, every place where there's been an awl pushed through the bark so that you can stitch. And here is a shot of, here's the man board. So coming out from this man board is that piece of cedar that has been folded over on itself and tied with basswood fiber. This is the inner wale that goes along the inside of the canoe. The outer wale, here's the hull in between. And lashing, or really using a fancy stitch to pull the outer wales together, again to provide some more rigidity for the bow and the stern of the canoe. And besides that, it looks really pretty. All right, so here's the man board with that piece of cedar sticking out, and the hull coming together in the back. Now you're going to be experts. You can go build a birch bark canoe. So all of this is kind of happening simultaneously. This is a student who is carving cedar in for the ribs, and other people are working over here to, I believe, sew patches. There's some knot holes that were in the hull, and they're working with the canoe turned upside down. So now comes the really stressful part of a canoe build, and that is placing the sheathing and the ribs. So again, the cedar sheathing here, remember it's about as thick as a cereal box, cardboard of a cereal box. And here's the ribs after they have been steamed and carved and fitted to be placed in a specific location along the length of the canoe. And remember, it goes in between the lashing. It goes under the inner wale. And you can also, I included this shot because you can see that edge of that bent cedar structure, and the holes have been made with an awl, and we're getting ready to sew the hull to that cedar internal structure. So before placing the ribs, before measuring the ribs, working to make the hull of the canoe as flexible as possible, so the canoe builders on the library floor is pouring hot water on top of the canoe. We had some towels and stuff to catch it, but a very important step in the process. And you can see the different pieces of bark. This is almost like a patchwork quilt of bark, and the different times that it was harvested. So this is really good winter bark here, and these pieces where the color is not as uniform or as dark were probably harvested just as the inner bark and the outer bark were starting to separate. So that's why you don't see, uniform inner bark. Okay, every time I look at these pictures, it's, take a deep breath. Everybody had to stay away from coffee so your hands weren't shaking, so that you weren't anxious, because this process, really you're putting a lot of force and you're pushing out the hull. And if you have a misstep, bam, a rib goes through the side of the canoe. We had that happen. So here's a rib that has been soaked. You can see that it's wet and it's being fit in, and the sheathing's put in just before the rib is put in. So what we did is we had these long, these pieces of rib that we kind of eyeballed for the correct length, got them wet, soaked them, and made them flexible, and then put them in the canoe temporarily so that they could assume the shape that they needed. And then we let them dry for a couple days, and then took them back out to trim them up and to make sure that they fit. Here they are after they've been dried. And here is the final driving of the ribs. And it's actually driving, right? It's using that wedge and a mallet to force the rib into a vertical position. You start on a diagonal with it hooked into the inner whale and the outer whale, and then you force the rib into place. So again, another layer, right? You've got that circular compression, and you've got this linear strength, and then you've got more circular compression or tension. We're getting there. Okay, so this is the next step in the process. So the ribs are in. The ribs aren't as even as we wanted because we had all sorts of people working on the ribs who were just learning. And the canoe builder said, I want to leave the uniqueness. I don't want to trim these. I don't want to make them perfect in my eyes. I want to leave the energy and the handprints of the people that made these ribs. So what's happening here is we're putting on a gunnel cap. So remember, we've got the inner whale and the outer whale. The hull kind of sticks up in between the lashing. The ribs go in between the lashing. And if you're a tired canoe paddler and you hit the side of the canoe, you're going to hit the lashing, which is not a good thing, right? You're trying to protect the lashing, so we put a gunnel cap on top. Again, a very long, clear, single piece of cedar that is held in place by cedar pegs. And we drilled holes with an awl into the inner whale or the outer whale, alternating kind of as we went along. So here's the final end of the cap, of the gunnel cap, where it really has to curve in tightly. A lot of tension, and the spacing on the ribs gets much shorter. Again, following the grain, following the way that the tree is growing, following what the tree is dictating as to how we bend it, watching it, listening as you're bending. You don't want to hear any little right? You want to do it very slow. So again, teaching the power of observation, not only with your eyes, but with your touch and with your ears, and teaching patience. Here we are just lopping off the tops of the pegs. And you would think that we were done, but there's all this to take care of, right? So the last couple steps before launch. Oh, I had to take this picture because I thought it was just so beautiful, this stitching along the bow or the stern. I can't remember which this is. And the root crossing that piece of cedar. So here's that outside edge of the cedar, and then all the fancy stitching. So now we're doing what we call etching, and that's what you see on these birch bark macaques, is etching. A lot of times when you look at these, you think, oh, that's a really nice color of reddish brown paint, right? But it's really the inner bark being scraped away to make these designs. So here we've got rabbits and birds and new spring greens and a butterfly. And then over here, another example of etching. This is a maple sap basket. I'll hold it in the light. You can see the different kinds of etching. So scraping away to leave a design or scraping away a design. And this has been sealed up with brittle spruce gum, because this is a bucket for carrying sap. So thinking about the water beings, because the canoe is a water being, thinking about the important metaphysical water beings to the Anishinaabe culture and putting them on the canoe. So these guys are upside down, but they are a whole series of thunderbirds. And then we added this underwater cat, who is a very important protector of the waters and the water beings, as well as a protector of the mineral copper, put on kind of the bottom of the boat to acknowledge them, to say, you can leave us alone, we're okay. And then sealing, using that spruce gum again to seal the stitching on the outside. So some canoe builders will use spruce gum, and maybe they end up burning it so it turns black, or they may add charcoal to it. So sometimes you'll see birch bark canoes where this is all black, but this canoe builder really wanted to leave it clear to be able to see the beautiful work of the stitching and to honor that spruce root. So there she is. She's finished, and we had a ceremony for her. We named her, and her name is Mano Mashkike. So Mano meaning good, Mashkike meaning medicine. She brought this 150 people together. We worked for at least 14 days, for as long as the library was open. So from like 8 in the morning to 11 or 12 at night, we shared food, we shared stories, we shared learning, we shared the cuts on our fingers and showing, what we had experienced as we were building the canoe. She really brought together an amazing canoe family. And that's how she got her name. And now it comes for the time for our honored guest over here. We're getting ready to launch the canoe. So again, February, right? Walking it out across the road into the Otonabee River. And knowing that right over here is the offices of all the upper administrative people. And if you notice, as we're walking out there, we don't have any life jackets. We didn't tell them. We didn't fill out any risk management forms for this. And then we realized that Sherry is out there paddling in full view of all of upper admin. So when we launched her, we sang for her, didn't we? And we followed the tradition of having an Anishinaabe Kwe be the first person to paddle, and an Anishinaabe Kwe from Alderville First Nation. Sherry Beaver right there. So there she is on the water. Okay, wow, I talked fast. I get so excited to share this story. Whoops. Come on. Okay, so I want to end, or maybe I won't end yet, because I have time to share more. There's that myth that people that appear confident are really quite over-prepared. I have a whole nother 20 minutes that I could share with you about trees. And I think I'm going to share just a little bit, because the way when Elizabeth introduced me, it talked about, or I wrote about making sweet water into sugar. And that's another very strong relationship with trees, right, and with maple trees. And I wanted to just show you the different materials or cultural materials used in kind of, not this photograph, but old style tapping and processing. And this is again that diagram, right, of the tree, but with a little bit more scientific knowledge inserted here. And it's important to know that the inner bark includes xylem, and that carries water and nutrients from the roots to the top of the trees. So it's a one-way vertical up. And the phloem carries sugar from the leaves to the growing parts of the trees. So it goes this way. And it's that unique structure, that one way up and one way down, separated by some tree tissue that creates along with the temperature gradient in Ziguan in early springtime, that creates that flow of sap when we can harvest. Here's an even more scientific diagram of the flow going up through the xylem, coming down through the phloem, and water actually going back and forth in between these two types of the bark. And it's important to know that in the springtime, as the tree is starting to wake up, and you can watch them, you can see the bark starts to change just before the sap starts to run. You can see that they're waking up. And so now they know that there's going to be new growth. They need to get the food up to the branches, and they take the stored starches and sugars in the roots, or the starches, convert it to sugar and send it back up the tree to help that growth of the leaves and then the maple flowers. Here's an old style way of tapping. You might recognize this dude, as he was our canoe builder. He's also a maple sugar practitioner, and showing us what his research has led to understanding the old ways of tapping. So rather than a metal spigot or a plastic spigot and plastic tubing, using a cedar spile that just goes into the bark, goes through the outer bark and into the inner bark, not all the way into the wood of the tree. And using an axe to make a V, so a cut this way, a cut that way, and then a horizontal cut that the spile is tapped into. Much more healthy for the tree. The tree recovers. You can see an old place where it's been tapped. And usually after a season, these axe cuts heal up. You can actually see the sap coming down the spile, and not being able to hang a bucket on this, right? So using biscuitagan. So this is summer birch bark. It's much thinner and much more flexible, and it's folded and tied with basswood fiber to create a bucket that's laid on the ground. And yes, stuff falls into it. Moths fall in there, bark falls in there, squirrels come by and take a drink, raccoons come by, sometimes flip it over, but it's that reciprocal relationship with the tree in all the relations. It's fine. Let's share with them. They need this nutrient-rich sap as well. So in the old ways, the Anishinaabe didn't make syrup. They took it down to sugar. And thinking about that ratio of sap to syrup being, depending on the season, about 40 to 1. So 40 gallons of sap to 1 gallon of syrup. It's almost a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of volume of syrup to sugar. So here's some sap being boiled in a copper trade kettle. Here is syrup being boiled down into sugar in a stainless steel pot. That whole process is one of my favorite things to do in the entire world. It's pure magic. It gets me excited every single time I do it. The process of watching, again, using those powers of observation, of watching the bubbles, the size of the bubbles, smelling the way that the syrup is, the smell or the scent of the syrup is changing, and listening to the way the bubbles are breaking is all the indicators of when it's ready for processing into sugar, when it when it moves from syrup to molten sugar. And here's that molten sugar being poured into a basswood sugaring trough. So a dry basswood sugaring trough. No varnish, no finish on it, just dry wood. So the pores in the wood, again, sucking out some more of the moisture from the molten sugar. And the molten sugar is manipulated with paddles, moved back and forth so it doesn't all harden into one chunk. And what we're doing is making granulated maple sugar. So here's the edge of a maple paddle here. And here is a traditional sugaring spoon that you can use to not only scoop out the sugar when it's finished, but using it to manipulate and push the sugar around and break up the chunks. And you end up with granulated sugar. And if you do this right, this process takes maybe 5 minutes from when you pour the molten sugar in to when you have it granulated. It's just like, wow, it's so cool. And knowing the history of maple sugar being stored, again, this is a very large birch bark macaque, so made very similar to these, only probably twice as big. It would hold about 60 pounds of maple sugar and used in trade. And used in trade across the Atlantic Ocean to provide sugar to the monarchies in Europe before sugar cane plantations. So we used to think about, where did all those macaques go? They're in Europe somewhere from the 1800s. We want those. And somebody probably used them as firewood, right? I might have I was going to tell you another story, but I won't. So getting back to what trees can teach us, what we can learn from the trees, and this sentence here, miigwech kenagego a miigwien metigog. Metigog meaning the trees, miigwech meaning a word similar to thank you. But this whole phrase, as it's strung together, is really thanking the trees for everything that they are and everything that they give. So thinking back about what we can learn from the trees, right? That patience, that power of observation, how to live in a rooted way when you're connected to the land and the water and connected to the sky world, connected to your ancestors, living in relationship with all of those other beings of creation, remembering that trees need carbon dioxide to photosynthesize and create those sugars and starches, and that trees give off oxygen. And we as human beings take in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. That reciprocal, respectful relationship between humans and trees. And think about what they provide in terms of beauty and inspiration and shelter and shade. And I firmly believe that if we view trees as our relatives, we might think a little bit more before we clear cut or before we commodify those beings into lumber, or consider them as resources, as natural resources, as opposed to relatives. So I want to thank you for listening to me take you on a journey, for clapping for Sherry, our canoeist. And I want to open up the floor to questions. Surely you have some questions. I always tell my students before they can leave class, I need to have 3 questions. And that always works. And then they get going. And then there's 7 and 10 questions, right, David?
So the way it's going to work is that Nedra here will have a microphone and ask a question of Barbara, and she'll come to you. And please wait till you have the mic so we can all hear your good question.
Oh, good. There's hands raised. Yay.
How heavy would that canoe have been?
Really good question. Probably about between 15 and 20 pounds. 13 feet long. Compare that to a Kevlar canoe, right? Yeah, pretty amazing, and just as tough as Kevlar.
Was the bark taken from an old growth tree or from younger birch trees?
So this one, because it was a patchwork, it was taken from younger trees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
2 questions. There has to be at least one more before I'm going to let you go.
Does the physical character of the tree change, or I'm sorry, canoe change once it's constructed? Like so it dries, for instance, further dries and so on?
Right. That's a really good question. These canoes are meant to be in the water and meant to be used and meant to be touched, because that interaction between the heat of our hands and the oil in the birch bark help keep it flexible. A lot of times, my understanding, and Jeff, you may know more about this, that in the wintertime, that many of the birch bark trees before freeze up, or birch bark canoes before freeze up, would be taken into a shallow part of the lake and filled with rocks and sunk so that it would stay moist through the winter. I don't know.
Can we see this canoe in Trent?
You can.
University? Where is
Yes, it is in the N. Wayne building, or Zowski College, in the gathering space. Yeah. And we're actually, we did a little bit of maintenance on it a couple weeks ago, moving around the spruce gum and checking for leaks, and discovered that some of the lashing had broken, dried out and broke. So we are going to be repairing it in probably the end of March. Probably a week-long project. Some of the ribs are cracked as well. But you can come visit. My office is right upstairs.
Barbara, do students who are studying more traditional forms of forestry, and I don't know anything about the science of trees at all, have access to the kind of learning that you shared with us today?
That's the goal. I can't speak for forestry departments. Somehow I doubt it. We're working really hard. You know, Trent is really working hard to privilege Indigenous knowledge, to bring it back, to insert it into curriculum, because of course it was, you know, suppressed by colonization and residential schools and all that. And that's, thank you for asking this question, because this is a plug for the Indigenous Environmental Studies and Sciences program. Because what we do is we bring together Indigenous knowledges and Eurocentric scientific knowledges that tend to be in a silo and tend to be with a really strong singular focus, where Indigenous knowledge is about relationship and about the whole entire ecosystem. So when you bring those two knowledges together, you have a much broader and deeper understanding of the environment. And I think also, and I think I might have said this on CBC radio this morning, that bringing Indigenous knowledge and that relationship quality and that philosophy brings in a different kind of ethics than Western or Eurocentric science may bring. And I'm not saying that Eurocentric scientists are unethical by any means, but it's a different way of viewing the world. Thanks for that question.
You're welcome. It seems like a good segue, unless there are other questions. Okay, there are. We opened it up.
Goodness.
There you go, Nish.
You're getting your steps in, Nedra.
How long did it take 150 students to make this canoe? And then traditionally, how many people would have traditionally made this kind of canoe? And how long might have it taken? I know that that might be hard to trace, but that's my question.
I got some answers to that. So, especially building this canoe, it was about 14 days, maybe 15. And of course, including that many people and novices that you're teaching makes the process take longer. Usually there are canoe builders that have a couple helpers or a family that builds canoes, and maybe the actual building of the canoe taking 7 or 10 days. The harvesting is the whole other story. I have no idea about how long that takes. Really good question. If you go on the National Film Board, there is a movie called Cesar's Canoe. It's totally silent film, but it is a master canoe builder, and it's a filming of him and his family making a birch bark canoe. It's really good.
I want to build on your point about relationships. It's my understanding that recent genetic research shows that trees and humans share genetics. In other words, way, way back, they were related. And secondly, that the sugar from the birch tree, which you didn't mention, is the one sugar that actually provides health benefits, including cleaning teeth and gums, that no other sugar in the world we know of does.
Thank you for sharing that. One of the unique properties of birch bark, and maybe that's part of the sap and the syrup, is the antibacterial properties of the bark itself. So storing food in a birch bark container works to prevent spoiling of the food. It's pretty cool. And fresh breath too, huh? Oh my gosh, why did I ask for 2 questions? No, I'm just teasing you. This is wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. The whole business of the winter bark and collecting the bark brings a bunch of questions to my mind, but like, when do they collect the winter bark? The picture you showed seemed to have leaves on the trees above it, and it also looked to me like it was doing something that we were always taught in wolf cubs: never cut the bark off the living birch tree because you're going to kill the tree. And you took an awful lot more bark off to make the canoe than we would ever taken to start a fire. So what do you do with the rest of the tree when you're done sort of getting a huge strip of bark? You're basically girdling the tree, I think.
Right, excellent question. So in the case of the photograph that I showed you, where we're taking really the bark off very deeply, that was in an area that was deemed for logging. And so there was a agreement between the forestry or the logging company and the local canoe and birch bark harvesters that before we log, go in and take the bark. So in that case, the tree was destined to meet its demise. In some cases, if you're not taking off canoe bark, but if you're taking off winter bark for containers and things, and you don't go as deep, the tree will scar and it will continue to live. And it takes, people have told me, I haven't validated this knowledge, but people have told me that after about 10 or 15 years, the scar starts to move from black to almost a regrowth of bark, but not pristine bark like that. And when you do the summer bark, it doesn't, it scars, but it doesn't girdle the tree. And we always like to think when you go through the woods and you see those strips of black on the birch trees that, oh, that's a sign that Anishinaabe have been through here and are practicing their traditions. Kind of like when you see the scraping of a bear's claws on a tree. You're like, oh, a bear was here. Well, that indicates that Anishinaabe were here. We like that.
Okay, well, then I guess it's time for me to say thank you, unless I don't want anyone to feel they didn't get heard. Okay, one more question?
Okay,
Kelly?
one more
Okay.
question.
Okay. Right, you're this lady here? Thank you.
canvas canoes, when we're not using them, we bring them onto the land and turn them upside down. Do you need to leave a birch bark canoe actually sitting in the water when you're not using it?
No. It needs to go in the water frequently, but you don't leave it there, no. It float away pretty quick.
So this one's a bit light, but why are you a grandmother with a capital G?
Oh, I didn't share that. Wow, you're a good listener and have a much better memory than I do. So Elizabeth and I were talking, right, because she was the one that was introducing me and said, so let's talk about grandkids. How many? How old? And I said, minus 6 months. My first grandchild is going to be born in April. But grandmother with a capital G is, so a grandmother in the Anishinaabe tradition, so past the life stage of being able to give new life, moving into the elder stage, and also being a woman who facilitates ceremony is the capital G. I do that when I write. I use capitalization as a kind of political statement sometimes, and encourage my students to do the same. But thank you so much for all the questions, for your interest. And I know that it's almost bedtime, but if you want to come up, and it is for me, right? If you want to come up and take a look at things, handle these, feel free. Feel free to cruise by and touch these beautiful objects.
But
Thank
before
you
we
so
do,
much.
I wanted to thank you, Barbara, for, I want to say these words: reciprocity, patience, flexibility, listening, respect, connecting, living in a good way. So if trees can teach us that, I think we need to pay more attention. And after listening to your words, I'm inspired to add a line to the Coburg land acknowledgement that we usually use, and to add something that I understand is used in Peterborough, which is we offer our gratitude to the First Nations for their teachings about our earth and our relations. So thank you for an absolutely inspiring, magical presentation, learning about the canoe and everything that trees can bring us. It was just fantastic. Thank you. And thank you for being here as a guest. So before you get up, tiny bit of housekeeping. Next week, you'll be delighted to hear that Phil Abbott, one of Barbara's graduate students, will speak here, same time, same place, on the destruction of old-growth forests by settlers in Northumberland County and its impact on the relationship of the I did way better before, Mississauga people and their territory. And then next Friday, we have our second book club event in Port Hope at the library on Friday morning. The book is called The Man Who Made Things Out of Trees by Robert Penn. And the moderator, Bob Hambley, asks you to bring your favorite thing made out of wood, if you can carry it, as part of the discussion next week. So if you haven't signed up for those two, please go on and do that. And then the last thing I want to mention is many of you know Ron Bolt, who is a local artist, a famous Canadian artist who happens to also be local. He's opening a 50-year retrospective exhibit of his work at the Art Gallery of Northumberland starting tomorrow. And Ron used to be a volunteer with NLC, so I wanted to mention that. Also, I wanted to tell you that his muse is water, so if you have a chance to look at his paintings, you might also enjoy them, Barbara. So thank you, everyone, for coming out. It was a great evening. Barb, over here, is holding up the poster for our concert. David Newland is here. You can ask him about it. It's on November 12th at the Trinity United Church in Coburg. It's a family-friendly concert of stories and songs about lost trees. And that's also available at our ticket page. So we hope you will come to that and to all the events that we're offering in the Power of Trees. Thank you so much.